So starting off will be Corey Shockey, and as with all of these folks, I'll just introduce them really quickly. You have the bios in the back of the room. Corey, as you know, if you've looked at this document, is research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and most recently editor with Jim Mattis of Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of her accomplishments. She really epitomizes, I think, as much as anyone probably taking part in this event, the blend of policymaking experience and scholarship that the Clements Center is all about. So it's particularly great to have you. Of course, we have had you before. You seem to be a regular at Clements events, but you are in many ways the perfect blend of these expertise. So it's good to have you back. And Corey will speak about the little understood, or the Cleveland administration, I think. And then we will move forward in time to Teddy Roosevelt, and Charlie Lederman will present. Charlie is, of course, in many ways the reason why we are here today. He is still the Harrington Fellow. This year at UT, I can say for myself, and I'm sure on behalf of many other people, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you here. We will absolutely miss you, and really we're grateful for this last opportunity in many ways to celebrate your accomplishments and the resources that you've brought to the study of the subjects that we're talking about today. So great to have you. Charlie, again, lots more that could be said, but I think maybe the most important news for Charlie is that he will leave here and go off to the War Studies Department at King's College in London. And many of you know the Clements Center has a wonderful partnership with that very department, so we will be seeing a lot of Charlie, no doubt, over the years to come very happily. And finally, my old friend Frank Gavin, who's wonderful to see back in town. Frank, as many people will know, was here for about 13 years.
We started the same year.
We did. We started the same month. Yeah, exactly. Wonderful to have Frank back. Frank has moved on. Actually moved on a couple of times. Moved on first to MIT and most recently to Johns Hopkins University, where he is now, I have to consult my notes on this one, the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor and the inaugural director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS. Frank is a distinguished author of important books about international finance and also more recently nuclear history. So he will speak about the Eisenhower administration. So Cleveland, TR, and Eisenhower sort of island hopping across the 19th and 20th centuries here. We'll see where this takes us. Please, Corey. Completely up to you as far as I'm concerned, but whichever you want.
In that case, I'll stay right here. So I want to talk to you about an American president in the finest conservative tradition. Somebody who vetoed the Farm Bill, vetoed a Veterans Bill, saying that federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character. Somebody who favored trade, who signed the Interstate Commerce Bill to reduce restrictions along state lines. Somebody who fought big business predation of the small man, took on the railroads, forced the return of 81 million acres of land that he thought had been stolen from settlers by the big business. He was a strike breaker, saying at one point when the railroad went on strike, which was preventing the distribution of mail, he says, if it takes the entire Army and Navy of the United States to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that card will be delivered. He refused the annexation of Hawaii, although it was put forward by his predecessor, because he believed it was an imposition on the democratic will of the people of what became that state. Moreover, he was a principled man in the finest sense, asking at one point when it was pointed out to him that vetoing a farm bill that would relieve pressure on Texas farmers in particular, and that could cost him the election, he thundered, "What is the use of being elected or re-elected unless you stand for something?" This man, Grover Cleveland, was also a member of the Democratic Party. He was its standard bearer. And I choose him because he's an illustration of the fluidity of party politics in the United States. That we tend to think of conservatism as only the calling card of the Republican Party. But Grover Cleveland, in fact, proves that the conservative tradition transcends party boundaries and party loyalties in the United States. I want to talk in particular about a moment in time in the 1880s and 1890s in which economic insecurity made American politics incredibly tumultuous. With the closing of the American West, there develops a concern that the American economy was inadequate to produce jobs enough for our population. And the role of trade in the American economy becomes the central issue in national politics. Grover Cleveland spent his 1887 annual address to Congress, what we now call the State of the Union Address, he devoted it in its entirety to making the case for free trade. That American industries were strong enough to bear the competition, that wages could be sustained despite it, that reducing prices for consumers was the main benefit to be sought. It was a virtuoso education in free market economics. It was, however, also a political disaster. The Democrats lost both houses of Congress in the 1888 election, and Grover Cleveland was bounced out of office by Benjamin Harrison. Republicans in the Congress proceeded to pass a sweeping tariff act that raised tariffs in some industries as high as 50%. And that had the predictable economic consequences of economic devastation. In the 1890 elections, so they passed the Tariff Act in 1890. In 1892, Republicans lost 50% of their seats in the House. And Grover Cleveland was reelected president, the only American president to serve non-consecutive terms in office. In this second administration of his, he also had the opportunity to navigate the most difficult international relationship of his time, that is the relationship between a rising United States and a hegemonic Britain. And he not only averted war over what is now an obscure crisis over Venezuelan debt and boundaries, he also managed to get the reigning hegemon of the international order to enthusiastically support the Monroe Doctrine of an American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how he did that, because it's a foreign policy achievement extraordinary in its grace. So Cleveland starts out opposed to the Monroe Doctrine. He says that he is, quote, quite willing to escape its serious contemplation because it's a doctrine which I knew to be troublesome. So it's ironic that he becomes the first American president to actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It had been settled American policy for 70 years, but across those 70 years, we lacked the ability to enforce it. In fact, the Royal Navy does most of the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine throughout, from the time it's declared in 1823 until the Venezuelan debt crisis in 1895. Venezuela and Britain had been arguing over the boundary of British Guiana and Venezuela for about 54 years. But in 1893 that Venezuela asks. They appeal to the United States for protection under the Monroe Doctrine. And so Cleveland has to make a choice. Britain had always flatly denied that the Monroe Doctrine had any validity. Moreover, flatly denied that the United States had any superior claim in the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, rightly so. Not only was it a doctrine unilaterally announced at variance with the rules of existing order, but Britain, because of Canada, had a territorial landmass in North America larger than the United States did at that time. In a dispute over debt and payment of debt, the British land marines seized the Venezuelan port of Corinto and refused Cleveland's kind of milquetoast recommendation for arbitration of this claim. The Secretary of State, Olney, issued a 12,000-word assertion, which the British wittily called Olney's 20-inch gun, asserting that the Monroe Doctrine was settled international law, but even if it weren't, quote, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law. The British government replied, Great Britain is an American power with a territorial area greater than the United States. Cleveland took recourse to that most terrifying element of American power, the United States Congress. He went to the Congress asking for support of his policy, including war with Great Britain if necessary. He did not, to the Congress, make the case that Olney made, however. He appealed on the basis that the United States did not need the consent of nations because, as the international order's only true democracy, our unique form of government made us a law unto ourselves. Congress passed the resolution without a single dissenting vote in either house of Congress. Right. The American public was baying for war. Teddy Roosevelt was cheerfully writing people that he was having great fun making jingo speeches. American generals publicly claimed that with 10 days preparation, we could take Canada. Interestingly, the British military did not disagree with that. They argued that the United States, having a continental-sized market, was immune from the blockades so we could negate Great Britain's major military advantage of the Royal Navy closing off commerce. What intervenes now at this point, though, what achieves a peaceful navigation of this is beautifully civil society in both Britain and the United States, because they don't start the crisis, the two societies, thinking of each other as similar. This notion of Anglo-America follows, doesn't force, a peaceful transition hegemonically between Britain and the United States. But they come to realize it in the course of this crisis. So American newspapers appeal to the British public for messages of peace, and to publish in newspapers to dial down this rambunctious American drive for war. Hundreds of them are received and published, including one from the Prince of Wales, the husband of Queen Victoria. 354 British members of Parliament appeal for arbitration, not just of this crisis, but of any potential for war between Britain and the United States. When Prime Minister Salisbury announces in the Houses of Parliament that the United States and Britain have found a peaceful way forward and Britain agreed to arbitration, he was cheered. Because by that point, war between Britain and the United States had come to be seen as fratricide. That happens in the course of the 1895 Venezuelan debt crisis. Britain wins a substantive victory, right? The United States team in arbitration basically gives the British everything they ask for, completely betraying the Venezuelans. The arbitration practice that Britain and the United States established, they tried to put forward by treaty. Irish Americans persuade the Congress that Britain is not yet to be trusted, and the Senate refuses its consent to the treaty. But Britain makes an enormous concession of power to an upstart United States, which quite flatly lacked the ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine or to win a war against Britain. And that was, they acknowledge an American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Great Britain not only acquiesced in this, they championed it. In 1896, Salisbury says, "We are entire advocates of the Monroe Doctrine. You will not find any more convinced supporters of it than we are." That is an enormous diplomatic achievement by an American president who saw an opportunity for a greater American role in the world and managed to achieve it by threatening war with the hegemon of the international order, harnessing Congress to make quite clear just how reckless the United States was willing to be on this, and yet spurred civil society involvement in a way that dialed the crisis down, achieving our objectives, but as Henry Miller pointed out, also achieving a good outcome for Britain. Thank you.
Everyone there. The president I'm going to be speaking about today is someone who has been held up as an example for Donald Trump in his foreign policy. Don't worry, I'm not going to be speaking about Andrew Jackson and the Civil War. The leader that I'll be talking about is Theodore Roosevelt, as Mark said. In an article shortly before Trump's inauguration, Neil Ferguson, channeling Henry Kissinger's writings, urged the new president to take Roosevelt as his model. Drawing on Kissinger, Ferguson presented Roosevelt as a practitioner of European-style realpolitik, for whom the only real law of geopolitics was the balance of power. Now, it's true that Roosevelt possessed a sophisticated appreciation of power politics, unique among American statesmen of his era. But he was not the archetypal realist of legend. His diplomatic outlook was not confined to conventional power politics. Ideals and values also shaped his outlook. For Roosevelt, it was difficult to separate power and responsibility. As his biographer John Milton Cooper has declared, Roosevelt was perhaps the most visionary idealist in American politics, appealing to transcendent ideals on exalted terms. Cooper, who is an author of both Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, argues that Roosevelt was in fact, in his appreciation, a more idealistic figure in his approach to foreign policy. And I'm going to get to that clash between Roosevelt and Wilson a bit later. But first I want to focus on an aspect of Roosevelt's thought that has not been fully explored, and one that casts light on his conservative idealism. That is Roosevelt's belief that the US had a responsibility to ensure that atrocities that offended the civilization of the age were censured, and the actions that Roosevelt took in support of this. When we talk about civilization with Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy, it's normally talked about in relation to his belief that imperial expansion led to greater order and stability. But there was another side to his conception of civilization, because during his presidency from his bully pulpit, Roosevelt articulated a set of principles outlining America's responsibilities to protest and on occasion prevent what he labelled crimes against civilization. The 1894-6 Armenian massacres, which claimed 200,000 lives, and the failure of any power to prevent them, had a profound impact on Roosevelt's philosophy. He frequently invoked Armenian suffering, the humanitarian cause célèbre of the era, as a symbol of man's inhumanity to man and the clearest justification for ethical interventionism. Roosevelt was conscious of the US dread of entangling alliances, but he strived to act with powers that he considered civilised when intervening overseas, and above all he believed the US should work with Britain. The broadness of Roosevelt's foreign policy philosophy is often overlooked. He certainly believed that Americans should first look to their own nation's security and rights, but he invariably stated that they should also stand for the rights and security of others. For Roosevelt, true humanitarianism and internationalism was inseparable from patriotism. In his words, it was only the nation that was most thoroughly saturated with the national idea that would have a regard for the rights of others, or a desire to remedy the wrongs of suffering peoples. As president, he would work cautiously but assiduously to convince his countrymen that they must use their newly established power, where possible, to prevent atrocities that violated contemporary civilised norms. He would engage in joint diplomatic interventions with Britain against anti-Jewish pogroms in Romania and against King Leopold's regime in the Congo Free State. These issues, while not the most critical that he handled as president, were central to his larger foreign policy philosophy. And in doing so, he would set the parameters of a public debate on America's responsibility to protest and prevent crimes against civilization. Now, to cast some light on this debate, I'm going to speak briefly about his policies towards the two most reactionary governments of Roosevelt's day, Tsarist Russia and the Ottoman Empire. These two polities were on the periphery of what Roosevelt understood to be the civilized world. Prior to 1914, you could travel across the globe without a passport, with the exception of those two empires as they sought to restrict the movement of their minority populations. The repressive policies of those two polities not only offended Roosevelt's sensibilities, but they also directly impacted American interests. And that was particularly the case with Russia's autocratic regime, because by 1911, America's Jewish population had multiplied to 2 million, with the majority fleeing Russian persecution. The restriction on Jewish liberties also applied to foreign Jews, so that included American Jews returning to their homeland. Roosevelt regarded this not only as a national insult, but also a violation of fundamental principles. In addition, Russian forces were entrenched in China, threatening America's open-door economic policy in that kingdom. But Roosevelt recognised that at that time, America was powerless to protect those interests, as it lacked the army or political will to do so. And it was in this context that Roosevelt responded to a large-scale pogrom in the Russian city of Kishinev by cabling an official protest to the Tsar. He also issued a strong public statement condemning both Russia's oppression of its Jewish population and also its China policy. And by linking the two together, he believed that he was condemning a government that was an affront both to American values and a threat to its interests. Now, most Americans shared Roosevelt's horror, but not many agreed with how he responded. Former Secretary of State Richard Olney, who was Grover Cleveland's Secretary of State, condemned Roosevelt for lecturing a foreign state upon the management of its internal affairs. He said, "Imagine the tempest of rhetoric if a foreign nation should retaliate in kind, should suggest that lynchings in this country were disgracefully frequent, and maybe Washington should do something about that." Others shared Olney's concerns. How could a nation in which lynchings were rife brazenly issue other states with protests condemning their abuse of human rights? The international press, not least in Russia, exposed this paradox, and the Russian ambassador actually issued a counter-protest against lynchings in the US. Now, Roosevelt was uncomfortable with these counter-accusations. It hindered America in, as he put it, taking the lead on behalf of humanity. Roosevelt's own position on race questions was complex, and I'll be very happy to talk about that further during the Q&A. But what's important to note in this context is that Roosevelt deplored lynchings, and he made headlines by publicly condemning the practices as unmitigated evil. But he did not see how the federal government could intervene. But ultimately, when a British humanitarian organisation protested against lynchings in the US, Roosevelt seized the opportunity to combine his rejection of race violence at home and his commitment to protecting persecuted minorities abroad. And he outlined this commitment in his 1904 address to Congress. Americans should prioritise dealing with their own sins, most critically violent race prejudice, over protesting against wrongdoing elsewhere. But as Roosevelt said, despite America's own very obvious shortcomings, it has a duty to censure international wrongdoing because it had, on the whole, demonstrated its commitment to principles of civil and religious liberty and orderly freedom. Roosevelt regarded lynchings, while he said that they were unlawful, unjustifiable acts, he thought they were incomparable with the cold-blooded, wholesale murder of Kishinev under the complicity of the central authorities. So this is how Roosevelt justified his belief that the US should intervene here, and after this he then went on to outline how it should respond. He said that actions depended on the degree of atrocity and the US power to remedy it. The cases in which the US could interfere militarily, as it did against Cuba in 1898, as it did for Cuba in 1898, were necessarily very few. But as Roosevelt said, the US would inevitably express horror on an occasion like Kishinev, or when it witnessed such systematic, extended cruelty as that which the Armenians have been victims. Now, this credo has been overshadowed by another outlined in the same speech, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which transformed that shibboleth into a more interventionist instrument for the US in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's second corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, though, is one that has been largely neglected. This is his principles of intervention in response to crimes against civilization. This also subtly inverted the Monroe Doctrine as it was originally conceived, based on separate spheres of influence and America's self-denying commitment to avoid interference in Europe. Now Roosevelt had justified America's interference in a nation's internal concerns, and done so by drawing on European examples of misgovernment. In some ways, this second corollary was motivated by similar concerns to the first, a dislike for disorder, a belief that power brought with it responsibilities, and a belief that the US should spread civilization, and he considered the US to be the principal agent of that. But there was an important difference between the two corollaries. The first ranked the US alongside the European powers, policing the Caribbean in the way that the Europeans did Africa and Asia. But the second corollary revealed that even among the so-called civilized powers, some were less civilized and should have their conduct regulated by a higher power. This second corollary was largely neglected at the time by Americans. It was pretty much ignored, but it did arouse strong emotions abroad where it was regarded as unprecedented. And unsurprisingly, the sharpest objection came from Russia. If you go through the Russian papers in this period, the phrase which keeps coming up again and again is this is a new Monroe Doctrine, with the US putting its fingers into every European pie. And in Germany there was alarm at what many observers called the Roosevelt Doctrine. And in France, the historian Henry Hauser observed that people don't hear anything in the press or in public except the American peril. The Hauser responded to that by saying, had the US not intervened for Europe's Jews while others did not lift a finger? And he warned his fellow countrymen that global governance was no longer a matter for Europeans alone. The US would have to be considered now. Now, Roosevelt's message raised hopes among Armenians, Jews and their supporters that he would intervene more vigorously on their behalf, and a number of petitions came into Roosevelt on that. And that was particularly the case after renewed massacres of Armenians broke out in 1904, and Roosevelt was urged to intervene. Roosevelt does send US cruisers to the Mediterranean to pressure the Ottomans to protect the rights of American missionaries, but he resists further intervention, mainly because of this muted public response in the US to his set of principles. He told an advisor that he was entirely satisfied to head a crusade for the Armenians, as he put it, but the country has not the remotest intention of fighting on such an issue. He had tried to rouse Americans, but accepted that they had no desire to back up words by deeds. And for the rest of his presidency, he was more cautious, and whenever he was asked to intervene in the future, he would invoke a dictum that he learnt on the frontier: never draw unless you mean to shoot. He was a practical idealist, but while in office, practicalities overrode his idealism. He refused to act unless he could do so with effectiveness and while maintaining American dignity by backing up words with actions. Nevertheless, this antagonism to Russia's autocracy would shape his outlook when the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904. He privately celebrated Japan's victory, describing it as the Japanese playing the game of civilized mankind. Unlike many European statesmen, Roosevelt did not believe that Russia represented the civilized West and Japan the backward East. His hostility to the Russian government was seen that they were despotic and expansionist, oppressing its own people and threatening American interests. Although Roosevelt's mediation of the Russo-Japanese War is often depicted as a classic balance of power politics, that is to ignore the decisive influence of the two nations' internal political systems on his diplomacy. While Russia was the only European power without a constitution, Japan was an Asian power with one. While Russia threatened the open door, Japan supported it. And by ensuring Japan's military victories were confirmed by a diplomatic triumph, Roosevelt identified a connection between the pursuit of American values and the protection of its interests. The Portsmouth Treaty ensured a semblance of the balance of power existed, with Russia retaining its presence in East Asia, but ultimately it ensured that that balance was weighted in favour of the more civilised Japanese, as Roosevelt saw it. And his diplomacy was also intended to advance the Anglo-Japanese alliance in East Asia, which he believed the US was an unofficial partner to. Roosevelt wanted to turn this into a more formal compact and a more formal alliance with Great Britain, but he recognised that wasn't possible. Politically it wasn't possible, and certainly its most ambitious element, that of a joint responsibility to prevent crimes against civilization, was not possible. He'd used his office to educate Americans on their nation's duty to use its power to prevent humanitarian atrocities, but he recognised that his policies required public support. He was aware that he was more willing than most Americans to interfere in international affairs, and while they might have been eager to protest against abuses, they weren't willing to develop the instruments of power that Roosevelt believed were necessary to make those protests effective. But within 10 years, Roosevelt, during the First World War, would have an opportunity to advocate for this when Armenian massacres broke out in the Ottoman Empire on an unprecedented scale. And Roosevelt's vision of America's duty to vindicate the sufferers of crimes against civilization in concert with Britain now provoked a public debate in American society. Roosevelt saw this as a unique opportunity to intervene directly to save the Armenians and to do so as part of an alliance with Britain. To his regret, he was not president at this time. His political rival Wilson was, and he ensured America's official response to the Armenian massacres was contained, and he refused to declare war on the Ottoman Empire even after the United States entered the conflict against Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1917. Now, these two different approaches of Roosevelt and Wilson to the Armenian massacres encapsulate their wider clash over America's global role. For Roosevelt, the US had a responsibility to intervene militarily if necessary to prevent abuses and punish the perpetrators, and should do so alongside nations that shared its ideals. And if the United States was unwilling to make that ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the Armenians, it meant, as he said it, all Wilson's talk of guaranteeing the future peace of the world was insincere claptrap and mischievous nonsense. Typical colourful Roosevelt phrases. On the other hand, Wilson did not believe it was America's duty to vindicate the Armenians by declaring war on their oppressors, or that the issue could be resolved until the war was over. Only then could the US take the lead in establishing a reformed international system in which the Ottoman Empire was dismembered and the security of the Armenians guaranteed through an American protectorate under the League of Nations. This clash between Roosevelt and Wilson over the appropriate American response to a humanitarian atrocity is one that reverberates to the present day. Now, Henry Kissinger has referred to the conflict between the two presidents as the hinge of American foreign policy, pitting European-style realist Roosevelt against a more parochial American idealism. But I would contend the contest between them is better understood as a contest between two different forms of idealism. While in office, Roosevelt was constrained in achieving those ideals by the limits of American power and by the confines of what was practically possible. Yet if we look more broadly at Roosevelt's foreign policy philosophy, it's possible to discern a consistent conviction expressed in and out of office that nations must uphold their most cherished values by force if necessary when they were challenged. Now, the legacy of Roosevelt's ideas on this are quite profound. Jeffrey Robertson, the UN Appeals Court judge and an expert on crimes against humanity, has pointed to that 1904 address as the intellectual origins of the responsibility to protect doctrine and Statute 7 of the International Criminal Code. Ultimately, though, what I've been trying to do today is try to show that Roosevelt was not necessarily a realist, but, to paraphrase Richard Hofstadter, that he's best understood as the conservative as idealist. Thank you very much.
Alas, I do not have fancy boots, but I will stand as well. And it's really wonderful to be back. It's always wonderful to be back in my old home, to see my great friend Will Inboden, the terrific stuff he's done with the Clements Center and his wonderful staff, to see lots of old friends, and really grateful to Charlie for this invitation. I'm a Harrington alumnus, so I think it was the second or third class I was in, so I'm an enormous fan of the program. So thank you. I confess, however, that before this invitation that I was completely unaware of the concept of conservative internationalism. And that's probably due to my poor reading habits, but with all due respect, reflecting upon it made me gently question the utility of these labels that we assign to various foreign policies in the world order. Now, to be sure, the urge to create these labels, these slogans, is understandable. That's our job as scholars, to provide order and structure to what in real time rarely seems coherent or unified. We attempt to identify key themes and principles that tie together what are often disparate, case by case, and highly contextual and specific policy reactions. That exercise is, as far as it goes, fine. But I think we should also recognize it has its dangers. We all know the stories, how Washington and Jefferson's quotes on permanent entangling alliances are often mistaken for each other and misunderstood, or how John Quincy Adams is not properly appreciated or understood, or how Wilson is not, upon close inspection, a Wilsonian. We actually knew what being a Wilsonian actually meant, or how, when we look at the documents, the JFK in the archive is nothing like the JFK of the Ted Sorensen soaring rhetoric speeches. And at the risk of insulting some of his amazing students, many of whom in this room and who are good friends, I would say my least favorite book of John Lewis Gaddis is Strategies of Containment. Why? Because I think it plays into this sense that most historians typically discount after spending time in the archives, that each new administration reinvents its foreign policy and grand strategy, driven in large part by ideological preferences. In fact, while the rhetoric of change and renewal is powerful, the reality is that there are powerful political and structural constraints, both domestic and international, to great shifts in American policy. Both push back, I think, against individual efforts of any president, regardless of their ideological or partisan preferences or even worldview, to make great change at the snap of a finger. We obviously see this today with President Trump. NATO, the East Asian alliances, our relationship with China, simply abandoning or radically changing long-held political diplomatic positions is not easy. Now, I don't mean to say that great change is impossible, or that there's no variation, or that it does not sometimes happen that traditions shift. There are moments when the shifts are possible and even necessary, when an ordinary way or frame or concept of thinking about the world is found wanting and replaced. But these changes, I think, are rarely captured in neat slogans with smooth ideological underpinnings. And that transitions to what I want to talk about now, which is President Eisenhower. I want to give you an example of an American policy that was utterly transformative, that altered deep traditions and reoriented the American trajectory of U.S. grand strategy and world order, that resonates to this day, but which really can't be understood, I think, through the lens of conservative or liberal world order. I'm talking in particular about Eisenhower's policies and strategies towards Europe, and specifically the development of policies and strategies to deal with the tangled questions of European recovery and integration, the German question, the threat from the Soviet Union, all taking place under the shadow of a terrifying new technology, nuclear weapons. Bear in mind what the situation was in 1950. At that point, the United States had eschewed permanent alliances. It had avoided robust conventional armies during peacetime, and rare was the stationing of its troops abroad. The American way of war involved slow, steady, massive mobilization and grinding down the enemy in long wars of attrition. And as Corey's excellent presentation showed, the decisions of national security strategy were as much, if not more often, the providence of Congress as the president. In less than 10 short years, every one of these circumstances became utterly transformed. How did this come about? How were these deeply entrenched practices and traditions overthrown, replaced by a massively forwardly deployed military presence, part of what is now as close to a permanent alliance as one can find, armed with a preemptive military strategy in which concentrated power in the hands of the president to the exclusion of Congress? It is an important and underappreciated story, one that has little to do with ideology, partisanship, or retrospective slogans, and instead, I think, highlights American flexibility and creativity in the face of powerful new challenges. Let me give you a brief overview of a story that many of you probably know, but which I think is underappreciated. In the late 40s and 50s, the United States faced a variety of interlocking challenges. First, the need to help Europe recover, but to do so, it had to allow the traditional engine of European growth, Germany, or in this case West Germany, to flourish. Understandably, this was a very hard pill for the rest of Europe, including Russia, to swallow, so soon after the horrors of the Second World War. European integration was the creative and innovative answer, first through the Marshall Plan, and then through support for the European coal and steel community. This, however, did not take care of the security angle. Remember, in the late 1940s, the U.S. possessed a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and the assumption was that the Soviet Union, as menacing as it might be, was not going to invade Europe. And the United States, soon after World War II, followed its traditional path of massive demobilization. But a series of issues, the loss of the atomic monopoly, the victory of Mao in China, the North Korean attack on the South, and especially China's intervention against UN forces, challenged core American assumptions. U.S. planners became terrified that China would not have intervened without Soviet approval, And the great worry was that the United States would find itself with most of its major forces pinned down fighting a war of very little strategic consequence, while Western Europe was completely exposed and vulnerable to Soviet intervention. What to do about this challenging problem? The Truman administration responded with a three-pronged strategy. First, a massive military buildup that reached almost 15% of GNP, which was not focused on Korea, but instead on new technology and on helping to rebuild military forces in Western Europe. Second, limiting the fighting in the Korean War to make sure that Korea was not lost, but that the war did not escalate, thereby sinking the United States deeper into a quagmire while other areas remained undefended. And third, rapidly entering into treaties, alliances, and military arrangements around the world, even with former adversaries. This is what President Eisenhower inherited. And there is no doubt that he made some changes and variations. The emergency military spending between 1951 through 1953 had shifted the military balance in the United States' favor, and cuts could be made. The Korean War was at a stalemate, and it was critical to end it. It was with the alliances and military arrangements, especially in Europe, where the Eisenhower administration brought about a real transformation. The North Atlantic Treaty had been signed, of course, in 1949, but there was little actual military planning or coordinated strategy. Nor had the thorny question of how to both include West Germany and its impressive military assets in this alliance without provoking World War III been quite figured out. You could only defend Western Europe with Western Germany. But how would you include this West German military power without not just provoking the Russians, but also losing the French and everybody else in Western Europe? For many, perhaps most in Europe, and not just the Russians, a remilitarized Germany was perhaps the greatest threat to European peace and security. Yet Western Europe could not be defended without it. This already difficult, almost impossible question was made even more difficult by the presence of nuclear weapons. Now, it's easy to forget, but at the time, the assumption was there was little that could be done to prevent the spread of this new fearsome technology, nor prevent its eventual use. When in human history, people like Eisenhower asked, had military technology ever been kept from sovereign states, especially a technology that arguably guaranteed the security and protection of a state from invasion? And what state in human history, other than West Germany, had a greater motivation to acquire this weapon? And what state, if it did acquire this weapon, would generate great amounts of stability and perhaps World War III? There was also a domestic element to this as well. West Germany was not fully in the Western camp yet. The experience after World War I had demonstrated that you needed policies eventually that showed the citizens of that country that whatever they signed on to was in their interest. So this was a lot to balance. You needed to rehabilitate West Germany, but not let it dominate Europe or threaten its neighbors. You needed to defend West Germany, but not allow it access to the most advanced military technology, nuclear weapons. You needed to provide West German citizens with the hope and some independence, while also constraining its freedom and sovereignty in important ways. You had to do this under the dual shadow of the Soviet menace and the nuclear revolution. This could only be done with active American engagement, a commitment that went against every one of America's long-held traditions that it had followed for a century and a half. Hammered out in political arrangements in Paris and London in 1954, and military arrangements negotiated in NATO, particularly through its military strategy, MC-48, the United States committed to a revolutionary strategy of large forward military presence in West Germany to back a preemptive nuclear strategy, where decisions about war and peace for the whole alliance would have to be made quickly and by a super-empowered president, or in actuality, perhaps a military commander in the field. To defeat the Soviets, you needed to use nuclear weapons. To win the Germans over to this strategy, you had to defend them at their border. You couldn't use nuclear weapons in Western Germany, right? No one's signing on to that strategy. So by definition, this had to be a preemptive strategy. So Eisenhower constructed a political policy that allowed West German political and military rehabilitation under the protection and watchful eye of almost 300,000 American soldiers, which deterred the Soviets with a military strategy that called for early and massive use of nuclear weapons. This was not in any sense Eisenhower's preferred strategy. This went against every ideological bone in his body. He wanted to see the Europeans defend themselves. He had decidedly mixed feelings about nuclear weapons. He did not like seeing a large peacetime American military presence. But the challenges of the time required extraordinary actions, and he, building upon the foundation set by Truman, adapted with the extraordinary NATO system. And it worked quite well. West Germany recovered economically, rehabilitated politically, contributed to the defense of the West without acquiring nuclear weapons, and you know the rest of the story. Most importantly, every president from that point on, regardless of ideology, accepted this bargain. It's hard to underemphasize how important and how out of the ordinary Eisenhower's crafting of this political, economic, and military arrangement was, or what an extraordinary departure it was from American diplomatic and strategic traditions. Was this liberal internationalism? Was it conservative nationalism? I leave that to others to decide. But my sense is this is one of those areas where those labels may obscure as much as they illuminate. Thank you.
So it seems to me, fortunately, we have plenty of time for questions and answers. And if you'll permit me, maybe I'll just dive in with the sort of low-hanging fruit here and pose, I think, a single question, but with phrased in slightly different ways given the different nature of these three papers. I think for Charlie and Corey, I would invite them to do what Frank did in the first couple of minutes of this talk, weigh in explicitly on the notion of conservative international, its utility, the extent to which the president about whom you spoke fits into that category. Any general comments that you'd like to make about conservative internationalism as a useful category. And for Frank, I mean, you did that, so I want to ask you something different, but I think gets at the same question. I've always been interested in the 1952 election, and I've always thought this is one of the really important moments in the post-45 political history of the United States, I think underappreciated in that regard. Can you sort of run some counterfactual for us that might have led to a different set of solutions under, let's say, a different Republican
President Taft.
Yeah, President Taft, thanks. Please.
Okay, I'll take first. But the reason actually I came to questions of conservative internationalism was through Thomas Knox's book on Woodrow Wilson, and when he's talking about conservative internationalism, he's doing it in relation to the League of Nations debate. And for him, the conservative internationalists are people like William Howard Taft and the people behind the League to Enforce Peace. And conservative internationalism has a very different definition to the one which Henry now presented to us before. For Knox, it's more about international legal arbitration, actually some of the things which Grover Cleveland is part of, but it also retains the unilateralism to be able to act on the international stage. Now, a number of those figures who are in the League to Enforce Peace come out of Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet. Eli Root is also part of this conservative internationalist tradition. And my sense was really with this was to go back and look at. It became more, as Frank was saying, with a discomfort with the present labels for Theodore Roosevelt. I think the realist label is overstated in relation to Roosevelt. He is a much more complex figure. I think by ending by talking about him as a more conservative idealist, which I think fits how he understood himself perhaps better, the internationalist elements of that, I think I'd be very interested to debate with people. One of the things that I wanted to emphasise is that Roosevelt's presented as a realist, but in that clash with Wilson, it's Roosevelt, as I said, who's a larger advocate of intervention on behalf of minorities. It's Roosevelt who calls for the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire along national boundaries, when Woodrow Wilson is still quite cautious about that. And it's Roosevelt who's the first American to advocate for an international organisation, which he does in his Nobel Prize speech and in articles prior to the war. So my sense was just to try and complexify that idea about conservatism, internationalism, and how it relates to the realist tradition.
So I struggle a little bit to answer that question. for Grover Cleveland, I mean, American politics are so internally focused throughout the entirety of the 19th century that internationalism is mostly all hat and no cattle in American foreign policy, right? Like the Monroe Doctrine gets declared in 1823 and nothing happens, right? Nobody else acknowledges it. It comes into being because the Russians are challenging, the Russians declared them, as Charlie suggests, Russian expansionism is one of the only international concerns the United States has at the closing of the 19th century. And the Tsar promulgates a policy that no other country's ships can come within 120 miles of Russian ports, which is, you know, Sitka, Fort Ross in California, not far from my home. And that's what actually prompts the Monroe Doctrine. It's not the notion of protecting the Western Hemisphere. It's the United States as a growing cross-continental power with no way to get between the Pacific and the Atlantic has to do something about it. So I think Americans are, and especially conservatives, are deeply skeptical about American involvement in the world. And for me, the reason that values matter so, that they weight so much in conservative internationalism, and the reason that Kissingerian style realism never really takes hold of the American consciousness is because our values are the way you get Americans to care about the rest of the world. I think it's especially true, like the notion of Theodore Roosevelt as a realist, I just don't get it, because he's trying to persuade Americans to care about the rest of the world, and values are the only way American presidents ever really succeed at that, certainly in the 19th century. And it's the only basis on which we get enduring commitment to stabilize Germany after World War II, to care about Japan, to continue to prosecute wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. So for me, conservative internationalism has to have an enormously heavy weight of the value of the we hold these truths to be self-evident, because that's the only way you motivate Americans to care about the world.
So it's a great question, Mark, and it's hard. I've been thinking, trying to run the counterfactual, and one idea that came to me is that actually both within the Truman administration and someone who was also very familiar to the Eisenhower administration did offer an alternative view, and that's George Kennan. Right? So clearly this is it's a moment of great change and challenge. B, there's a variety of ways you can construct it, and the NATO solution is actually the result of a failed earlier attempt to do the European defense community, which was this effort, which was to every American instinct to let the Europeans fix this on their own and not become permanently engaged. And you know, Kennan's argument, and he argued quite passionately at that point throughout this time, was that this is not the way to do it. What you do is you sort of allow Germany to unify, to be neutral. You hope both sides pull aside, and then you give the Germans sort of a sphere of influence in Central Europe. Well, you know, this quickly becomes not appealing to anyone in Europe, that it also completely underplays the significance of the nuclear question, right? So is this neutral Germany that's in a kind of a sea of uncertainty, not going to get itself its own nuclear weapons? If it gets its own nuclear weapons, is this going to, it's the one thing that the Soviets would fight World War III over. And so what I'm wondering about with Taft, some of these things, these centrifugal forces were just pulling structural forces in certain directions, and they could easily have been rejected. The Kennan-esque policy could have been pursued, a policy that says, you know, more return to American-like Europe sort of. But bear in mind too that there was a scarring sense that had been tried after World War I, which is why they were revisiting this question all over. The Taft idea had been, we had seen elements of this, and even though we exaggerate the isolationism of the sort of the Hardings and the Hoovers and the Coolidges, there was a certain sense that that option had been tried. And so what would be interesting, I have no idea how the experiment would have